This is the third in my trilogy of what I call the 3 Tucker Carlson questions. The 3 questions that Carlson asked many of his guests were: question number 1, why did so many culture wars escalate so suddenly in 2020 and beyond? Question number 2 was, how should we respond to all these divisive attacks? And question number 3 was, how will this end for the country? I made separate videos for questions 1 and 2. This video shows the answers for question number 3 from 17 of his guests. To quickly review the context for question number 3, it's worth remembering that in 2020 we saw the explosion of so many different culture war, identity, politics issues in our society. These movements included the following: Black Lives Matter and attempts to defund the police, diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates forced on students and employees, irrational COVID-19 policies that were that infringed on people's individual rights, media censorship to try to influence the 2020 election against Donald Trump, transgender activism to try to invent new rights and redefine the concept of sex, and finally, attempts to censor any opposing viewpoints through cancel culture. So the pressing question for people who oppose these movements is, are we going to continue along this trajectory that started more or less in 2020, or is this more of a cycle that's going to tip back towards conservatism? And if it's not a cycle, how bad is it going to get, and how long is it going to last?
I ask everybody this. Maybe it's almost a rhetorical question at this point, but where does it go? When does this end? When does the darkness lift?
You know, back to Camus, they had no idea when they were writing Combat, their dissident magazine. They had no idea when it would end. They had to carry on as though it would someday, because that gave them hope. But they had no indications as to when that would be, and I don't either. I wish it were soon. I wish it were not a matter of years, but a matter of months, but I fear it will be a matter of years. And until people start to feel that icy grip and start to see it really, I think, as an obstacle to their own self-expression and growth as human beings, it's going to be with us, this monster.
This may be a little specific, but the Spanish Civil War, have studied it. What are the lessons of it?
The basic lesson of the Spanish Civil War is that once the left gets going in its grab for power, which is typically exemplified by the attempt to delegitimize any backsliding, that is, any electoral success of the right is regarded as de facto illegitimate and the basis for violence, ultimately, against the right in order to maintain left gains. Once that process gets going, it almost always, unfortunately, leads to actual violence, because the left project, as I say, is utopian. And anybody who stands in the way of that utopian project is by definition not just someone you disagree with, or someone who thinks that the capital gains tax rate should be slightly different than it is, but an existential enemy.
Do you have hope for the West that we can stop what seems inexorable, unstoppable?
Of course, yes. I'm realistic in the short term. I think that the years to come will be difficult years, very difficult years.
How?
I think that this technocratic system and this rationalist ideology will impose itself in a radical way to our society. Everyone who doesn't want to go along with it will be excommunicated, I think. But if this group should choose to, we should continue to speak out, no matter how difficult it becomes, it will survive.
Where do you think this is likely to go, the crisis in the West right now?
Well, it all depends on what choices we make. And somehow, if you get stuck in that cycle of thinking it's only about some sort of fate, you know, we're going in this direction because, well, that's where we're going to go. That's not true. That's not accurate. You go in that decision, in that direction because you've made a decision to go there.
What happens if we don't do this?
I think the polarization will get worse and worse and worse. And I think public opinion could eventually come to a breaking point. I mean, I guess you'd have to say there's two possibilities. One is the red parts of the country they give up and they say, all right, we're never going to get out from under and there's nothing we can do. The other possibility is you could see some kind of, a real revolt. That is to say, if people make over time repeated good faith efforts to resolve this question politically at the ballot box, if through compromise, and are just told over and over and over again, no, you could see a backlash that could take a number of forms.
And again, sooner or later, I think it will force a reckoning, both personal reckonings, but also a society-wide reckoning with, hey, this is what we've done. What are we going to do about it?
Is this getting better or worse, or what happens next?
Europe is going to fall apart, and there's going to be very significant change. We've already seen governments fall in Sweden and Italy. We see Sri Lanka, Haiti's probably next. I think we're going to see a huge turnover of the political class over the next 3 years or so. We could see very different heads of state. There's going to be a lot of darkness there. There's going to be a lot of violence. There's going to be a lot of suffering. That's going to be part of the process, but I do think it's going to give a chance for something new to emerge, something clearly, we're coming out of the post-Cold War neoliberal era. Clearly the world's reverting back towards the nation state. I think that's healthy. We went way too far with globalization and neoliberalism.
There's a large audience that it is willing to accept the noisiness and messiness of open discussion in order to hear things that are not prepackaged for them. And I'm hopeful.
We probably got, depending on history, 5, 6, 7 more years of things like this. But then here's the good news. No pandemic is forever. No war is forever.
It's just incredible. These people are spoiled to death. They've been given license to act out this fantasy of anti-bourgeois rebellion, and they know that everything's going to hold together. Well, they're wrong. Americans are very naive about civil anarchy. We think we can play with fire endlessly, of exacerbating ethnic and racial tensions, and that we're not going to end up like Rwanda.
Well, so what is the answer? How does this end?
Those people, I think it's Last Japanese Soldier in the Jungle, right? Who didn't get the message the war is over. I think the country as a whole is going to leave those people behind real soon now.
Oh.
I think the country as a whole is tired of it, and we're about to have a pretty significant inflection point. But I don't know where those people go from here, because they've built their entire sense of self, they've built their social identity, their professional identity, their entire view of who they are in the world on a set of symbolic performances that I think they need to sustain. And I don't know how that conflict plays out.
What are the consequences of this moment, do you think?
I think it's very helpful to look back on the 17th century. The denunciation of heretics, which is really central to the woke project, is much more 17th century behavior than we realize. The witch hunting that goes on campuses or on the internet. And I think it may be a kind of version of the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was a war of religion that devastated Europe.
What are the future tests going to look like?
Well, I think part of it too was a test on the government to see how far can we push these people. That's my honest opinion. How far can we push these people? Because the church historically has always been the thing that's risen up against tyranny. Has always been the thing. I mean, since the foundation of America.
Last question, where do you see this going? I mean, does it, I think the assumption a lot of us have had, perhaps too optimistic, is that it will ultimately burn itself out because like the French Revolution is just too absurd, but does it, or?
Well, I don't know. The DEI bureaucracies, okay, and these are run by people who have created a career of, they would call it trying to ease racial tension, but I think objectively looking at it, it's to maintain it by maintaining group identities. So I'm not so sure how easily it's going to go away. It's not going to go away in New York. It's not going to go away in California. Florida is making strides. I think this is going to be a conflict at least for another generation, because it's been going on for a generation now.
Like, what's your view going forward? Are you more or less hopeful? I mean, what do you honestly think is going to happen?
I think that I always believe if you can awaken the American people, I mean, that is a mighty beast that nobody can counter.
Is the revolution almost over?
We're certainly seeing a correction right now.
especially in culture. But that was always going to happen because the excesses have gone so extreme.
Yes.
But it's never enough because the left goes 10 feet and then they retreat 2 feet. And it happens every time.
I believe the American people, they're very tolerant people, Americans, and they're willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, but there is a limit. And on the other side, the left never knows when to stop. That's one thing you can count on them for. So indoctrinating kindergarten kids is a bridge too far, should we say. And Americans are finally waking up. And when Americans wake up, they're a formidable force. So I remain an optimist that we can win this, but only if everybody gets into the fight.
After watching those clips, it seems clear that there was some agreement on a few things. One was that the identity politics culture wars were just starting rather than nearing an end. And another was that nearly everyone thought there would be some reversal of identity politics or a reckoning of some sort. But beyond those things, I don't think there was much of a consensus about how intense these were going to continue or when they were going to end. My personal opinion is that while it is impossible to predict how these are going to play out because things are just so complicated, I think that in the broadest strokes, it's really not that complicated. And I base that on the following 3 points. Point number one is that the culture wars have really already been going on for over 100 years. Many scholars would date the beginning of some version of culture wars since the presidency of Woodrow Wilson in 1913. Then the 1930s saw the expansion of new rights and entitlements under the presidency of Roosevelt. Then the 1960s saw more of the same under President Johnson's Great Society. Then 2010 saw another achievement of sorts with Obamacare. And so the 2020 uptick of these types of culture wars was really just more of a shift in strategy for progressive liberals. The history I just described is covered in detail in a book by Charles Kessler called Crises of the Two Constitutions, published in 2021. Kessler also explained in that book that the central issue of these culture wars is really the Constitution of the United States. Conservatives still value the original Constitution with its limited set of natural rights. Liberals, in contrast, have spent the past 100 years trying to create new rights and entitlements through what they call a living constitution, meaning that it can be interpreted nearly at will according to their agenda. Next, my point number two is that reckonings of some sort have already been going on for about the past half century. And one way to illustrate that is through the balance of power through national elections. From 1969 to 2024, one party will have control of all three bodies only 29% of the time. The last three presidents, Obama, Trump, and Biden, each were given only a 2-year window to make changes with control of all three bodies. My third point is that one could argue that the intense conflicts that started in 2020 were in some sense a good thing. I mean, they certainly weren't good for all the people that were harmed, but it was good in the sense that it clarified some things. It laid bare just how much progressive liberals disdain and or fear conservatives because conservatives don't believe what they believe, and it illustrated just how far they were willing to go. I don't think those things were that clear to many conservatives, including myself, prior to 2020. Lastly, we can't predict how things will end right now, that is in August of 2023, but I think going forward, it helps us understand the things to watch for, which I think are two main things. The first thing to watch going forward is the type of issue that's being fought over. Some issues are more important than others. For example, the tax rate on capital gains is not probably an issue that's going to tear the country apart. But any attempts to fight over issues that involve rights, which are de facto the basis of the Constitution, either by taking away old rights or by trying to create new rights, are the sort of issue that can tear at a country. The second thing to watch for is emergence of new crises. In times of crises, citizens tend to be more willing to accept authoritarian control that limits their rights. Crises can be in the form of things that we can't control, such as economic disasters, cyber attacks, or pandemics. But crises can also be fabricated. And I think the main thing to watch for going forward is, in order to predict how this ends, is whether progressives are trying to fabricate new crises. I'll end with several recent examples of how progressives have attempted to try to keep the nation in a state of perpetual crisis.
What the president, his denial at the beginning was deadly. His delaying of getting equipment to where it continues, his delay in getting equipment to where it's needed is deadly.
And the climate issue is not a bilateral issue in our judgment. President Biden believes, as I think most of the world does, that the climate crisis is a universal threat to humankind. And we all have a responsibility to deal with it as rapidly as we can.
Normally, the aesthetics of a speech are not that important, but my word, they were here. It was a dark, incredibly disturbing setting and a dark and incredibly disturbing speech. You know, Joe Biden came in and was elected president because he wasn't Donald Trump and because he promised to be the great uniter of America. And goodness knows America needs unity. And instead, just ahead of the midterms, we see that Joe Biden has given up on that aspiration. He's decided instead to be a great divider. He's decided that it plays better to his base to talk about, I mean, you remember in 2016, Hillary Clinton described Republicans as basically a basket of deplorables. Joe Biden went much further than that. He said MAGA Republicans are semi-fascist. By the way, I don't know what semi-fascist means. It sounds like being a little bit pregnant.